On March 6, 1945, the heart of Cologne was a fractured monument to a dying empire. The cathedral's blackened spires loomed over streets filled with ash and twisted steel, a ghost of their former grandeur. From the gunner's seat of a Tiger tank positioned near the square, Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann leaned into his cracked periscope, breath fogging the lens. He had seen hundreds of American machines before. He knew the loping silhouette of a Sherman, the stubby barrel of a Stuart, the thick armor of a Jumbo. Each model, each weak spot, each trick of American armor was etched into his memory after 3 relentless years at the front. But the shape now sliding through the smoke wasn't in any manual. Low, angular, purposeful. It moved with a calm assurance that felt alien. The barrel was longer than anything he'd seen from the enemy, its muzzle brake casting a distinct shadow in the late afternoon haze. The hull seemed crouched, armored skin flowing into hard lines rather than the boxy shape of Sherman's. Hoffmann's heart began to pound. "This isn't a Sherman," he whispered into the intercom, the words tight and dry in his throat. His crew stiffened at the tremor in his voice. They had never heard him sound afraid. Outside, artillery thudded in the distance. The Americans were advancing toward the Rhine like a tide that no counterattack could fully turn back. For months, German tank crews had comforted themselves with the same cold calculation. Their guns outranged the enemy's. Their armor was stronger. If they saw the enemy first, they would survive. But in that moment, staring at the dark shape easing through the rubble, Hoffmann felt something unfamiliar: uncertainty. Through the damaged glass, he could make out the massive gun stabilizing on the move, as though the vehicle were unbothered by the jagged ruins around it. The machine had the presence of a hunter, not prey. His mind flipped through recognition charts, intelligence briefings, whispered rumors from the Ardennes. Nothing fit. He reached instinctively for the trigger controls, but hesitation crept in, a sliver of doubt sharp enough to cut through the years of drilled-in confidence. A Tiger crew was trained to act, not wonder. Yet here he was, wondering. Across the square, a panther had already tested this unknown beast and paid the price. Its burning carcass spat smoke into the cold sky, testimony written in steel. The crew hadn't even had time to radio what killed them. 18 seconds later, the world around Hoffmann would change. The new American tank, what history would later call the M26 Pershing, lowered its long barrel. The crack of its 90 gun split the square like a hammer blow. The sound arrived a heartbeat after the flash. In a war defined by numbers and production lines, this moment wasn't about statistics. It was about the death of an illusion. German armor had ruled the battlefield for years, its legend built on distance and fear. But on that gray March afternoon, in front of Cologne's cathedral, that legend met its reckoning. Before the Pershing ever rolled onto European soil, the German heavy tank crews believed themselves untouchable. That confidence wasn't just pride, it was arithmetic. For years, the battlefield had proven that mathematics favored the Tiger. Since its debut at Leningrad in 1942, the Tiger I had rewritten the rules of armored warfare. Its 88 gun could knock out Allied tanks long before enemy gunners even found their range. A Tiger positioned well could turn a battlefield into its personal hunting ground, its shells slicing through Sherman armor at distances the Americans had thought impossible. For the men inside those steel beasts, it felt less like fighting and more like executing an inevitable result. The armor told its own story. A 100 thick front hull, a 120 turret face. Allied 75 guns might as well have been throwing stones. Sherman crews learned to fear the long-barreled shadow of a Tiger. They whispered about it in their camps and in their reports, often misidentifying every German tank they saw as one of the dreaded big cats. Tiger fever, they called it. The kind of fear that killed faster than shrapnel. German tankers, meanwhile, Bathed in a sense of invulnerability, they painted kill rings on their gun barrels, like Luftwaffe aces painted victory marks on their planes. Many believed the Tiger was more than a machine. It was a shield against the chaos of war. Veteran crews spoke of the quiet surge of power when their optics caught a distant Sherman in their crosshairs, knowing the outcome before the trigger was even squeezed. This confidence wasn't just psychological, it was tactical. German doctrine had evolved around their technological edge. Tiger and Panther units dug in at long range, exploiting superior optics and penetration power. They turned valleys, crossroads, and bridges into killing zones where Allied formations shattered against invisible guns. One well-placed Tiger could stall an entire armored column. No story illustrated this better than Villiers' Bocage. June 1944. SS tank commander Michael Whitman faced a British armored advance and, in minutes, transformed the battlefield into a graveyard. 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other vehicles, all silenced by a single Tiger. Whitman became a legend, the embodiment of German armored dominance. This legend wasn't lost on Allied crews. Many entered battle already convinced they were outmatched. Reports often claimed Tiger encounters where none existed. Even a lone Panzer IV might be mistaken for a Tiger in the panic of combat. German tankers in turn fed on this fear. Their morale was built not only on thick steel and high-velocity shells, but on the invisible weight of reputation. Behind this confidence, however, was something even more powerful: belief. The men in these tanks had come to see technological superiority as a constant, a fixed law of war. While Germany's strategic position weakened, while resources dried up and air raids grew relentless, the Tiger's silhouette remained their psychological anchor. Crews joked grimly that they didn't need to outrun the war, they just needed their tanks. The Tiger was their fortress, their last guarantee in a crumbling Reich. What they couldn't know was that far from the front lines, across the ocean in Detroit, the United States was already forging a weapon designed to end that certainty. The myth of invincibility was real, and like all myths, it was waiting for its reckoning. While German tankers wrote their legend in mud and fire, a very different kind of war was being waged an ocean away, in the quiet roar of Detroit's factories, amid the clang of steel presses and the endless rhythm of assembly lines. The United States was building a weapon to erase the Tiger's certainty. By late 1942, American commanders and engineers knew the Sherman's days as a frontline champion were numbered. It had been born for a different war, one where German armor was lighter, engagements closer, and firepower balanced. But the battlefield had changed. In North Africa, Italy, and Normandy, Shermans met Tigers and Panthers. They could barely scratch. Every after-action report told the same story. Allied crews were brave, but bravery wasn't enough. The answer was Project 226, a heavy tank concept buried under layers of secrecy. The goal wasn't simply to build a bigger gun. It was to match and surpass German armor without sacrificing the industrial tempo that made American war production unstoppable. This was a design born not from panic, but from calculation. In 1943, contracts rippled across the American industrial map. Fisher Body, General Motors, and dozens of subcontractors retooled overnight. They cast turrets in ways no German factory could match for speed. They developed new transmission systems capable of handling greater weight. And they looked to the Army's anti-aircraft program for inspiration, where a 90 gun had already proven its lethality. If that firepower could be mounted on a tank, the playing field would change overnight. Secrecy was absolute. Many workers didn't even know what they were building. Turret components were shipped separately, hull castings labeled under false codes, blueprints compartmentalized, so no single plant held the whole picture. Even inside the Army, only a small circle of officers knew the true nature of the project. The weapon they were forging would become the M26 Pershing, A tank built not only to pierce armor, but to shatter the myth of German invincibility. It was a war machine with a 90 gun that could punch through a Tiger's front at battle ranges where the Sherman had only prayed. Yet perhaps the most devastating element wasn't the gun or the armor or the turret. It was scale. America could build hundreds of these tanks while keeping Sherman production alive. Germany, strangled by bombing raids and collapsing resources, could never match such industrial elasticity. While German crews trusted in their Tigers, like medieval knights trusted in their plate armor, men in Detroit worked in shifts around the clock, producing the means to tear that armor open. The myth was still intact in Europe. In the factory halls of Michigan, the counterpunch was already being forged. On a freezing January night in 1945, the docks of New York's port lay cloaked in fog and blackout darkness. Cranes groaned softly as cargo vanished into the holds of waiting ships. Among the crates and tarps, something far more valuable than ammunition or rations was being moved in silence. The first M26 Pershings. They weren't logged as tanks. The manifests listed them as heavy maintenance equipment. Even the dock workers didn't know what they were handling. Each Pershing was wrapped in waterproof covers, coated in grease, and stacked behind rows of Shermans so that even a curious glance would see only familiar silhouettes. A small group of hand-picked crews watched from a distance. They had been training in secret at Fort Knox for months, rehearsing everything from gunnery to cover stories. These men weren't just tankers. They were couriers of a technological secret. Their orders were clear and unforgiving. Speak of nothing, failure meant court-martial. The voyage to Europe took 11 days through waters haunted by U-boats. Below deck, Pershings waited in silence, like predators in a cage. The crews spent their nights hunched over recognition charts, committing every angle of German armor to memory. To the rest of the ship, they were just another replacement unit. When the convoy reached Antwerp on January 26th, the offloading happened as quietly as the departure. No fanfare, no headlines, no photographs. Special trains carried the tanks through the night into Germany's shadow, to a staging area near Düren, where the 3rd Armored Division was preparing for its final push toward the Rhine. It was here, away from the front lines, that the Pershings shed their disguises. Crews performed final calibrations on the 90 guns, tested turret rotation, and camouflaged the tanks with standard olive drab markings to blend among Shermans. From a distance, most German spotters wouldn't know what they were looking at. Up close, it was another story entirely. The German intelligence network never saw it coming. They knew the Americans could build more tanks. They had counted on that. What they hadn't imagined was that the U.S. could build differently, that it could produce a tank capable of challenging their best while keeping the entire operation invisible. For the men of the 3rd Armored, there was a shared understanding that these machines were something extraordinary. They called them secret weapons, though none had yet fired a shot in anger. A single order hung over the crews like a loaded gun. Reveal nothing until the enemy forced your hand. The Pershing's arrival wasn't a parade. It was a whisper carried across the Atlantic. A ghost had entered the battlefield, and no one on the German side knew it was there. February 26, 1945. The night sky over Elsdorf was cold and sharp, the kind of stillness that made gunfire echo for miles. In the darkness, the Pershing, nicknamed Fireball, moved cautiously through the ruins of the German town. The crew had been briefed on the risks, but nothing could prepare them for the ambush waiting ahead. From the shattered upper floor of a building, a Tiger I lay in wait, its gun trained not on a column, but on a single target. The Tiger's crew had seen Shermans fall in flames countless times. They didn't yet know this was something else. To them, it was just another American tank entering their kill zone. The 88 gun thundered. The first round slammed into Fireball's mantle with brutal precision. Shrapnel tore through the turret, killing the gunner and loader instantly. The shockwave punched through the rest of the crew compartment, flooding it with smoke, sparks, and screams. The Pershing ground to a halt, its engine hissing under the sudden weight of silence. But this wasn't a typical Allied tank. Even shattered, Fireball did not burn. Its armor absorbed what it could, and its structure remained intact. Within minutes, American infantry secured the area. Instead of being abandoned to the flames, as so many Shermans had been before, Fireball was recovered under fire, dragged back from the front lines like a wounded giant refusing to die. 3 days later, the tank that had taken a Tiger's best shot returned to service. A new gunner stepped into the turret. The barrel was straightened, the systems repaired. The Pershing rejoined the push toward the Rhine as if it had only blinked. For the Germans, this skirmish barely registered as a victory. For the Americans, it was proof of something powerful. The new tank could be hurt, but it would not break easily. The battle had claimed its first Pershing, but it had also written the first line of a new reality, a tank war, where even the Tiger could no longer guarantee survival. March 6, 1945, Cologne. Smoke drifted like tattered banners over the ruins. The cathedral towered above it all, blackened but unbroken, a silent witness to what was about to unfold. Around the square, German forces had positioned their last armored teeth. A panther crouched behind rubble, its gun commanding the open street. Inside the tank, Wilhelm Bartelborth, a seasoned commander, leaned forward against his periscope. Through the haze he caught movement. A Sherman, or so he thought. A low silhouette creeping toward the square, but something about it felt wrong. The barrel was longer, the stance heavier. Still, at 300 meters, a Panther had no reason to hesitate. Target front, fire. The German gunner squeezed the trigger. The high-velocity 75 mm round roared downrange and struck the Pershing's glacis in a burst of sparks. But instead of tearing through, the shell ricocheted upward, shearing stone from the cathedral wall. Bartelborth froze. That wasn't supposed to happen. Inside Eagle 7, Staff Sergeant Robert Early steadied his breath. The shock of the impact rattled the hull but didn't breach. "Gunner, on," he barked. Corporal Clarence Smoyer had already lined up his shot. The Panther was still visible, muzzle flash still fading, its position exposed. Smoyer's finger tightened on the trigger. The 90 mm gun cracked like a hammer, splitting iron. In the next heartbeat, the Panther's turret face erupted. The shell punched through the armor as if peeling it open, igniting ammunition and fuel. A column of flame rose from the Panther's hull, the fire consuming everything inside. Cameraman Jim Bates, crouched with the Signal Corps crew, captured the scene on film. The footage would become one of the most iconic tank duels of the war. Not because it was long, but because it ended in less than 5 minutes. Another German tank attempted to swing around from a side street. Accounts would later argue whether it was another Panther or a Tiger, it didn't matter. Eagle 7's gun was already tracking. One more round. One more flash. Another burning wreck. The square fell silent, except for the crackle of fire and the distant rumble of advancing troops. For the German defenders, this was more than just the loss of 2 tanks. It was the first undeniable proof that their armored supremacy could be matched and beaten on open ground. Inside Eagle 7, the crew didn't cheer. They exhaled. They had faced the best the Wehrmacht could field and survived the first exchange. Outside, the cathedral still stood, scarred but unbroken, like a monument to endings. This duel wasn't just recorded on film, it was etched into the psychology of 2 armies. For German crews, the myth cracked here. For American tankers, the legend of the Pershing began. The duel at Cologne didn't end with 2 burning tanks. Its real detonation happened after the smoke cleared. Within 24 hours, reports began trickling through German communication channels. Panther crews, who'd survived nearby positions, spoke of an American tank with a barrel far longer than anything they'd faced. They described its frontal armor as impenetrable and its gun as like artillery. None of it fit existing intelligence charts. The Oberkommando West demanded immediate confirmation. Intelligence officers scoured every technical manual, every intercepted message, searching for a match. There was none. For years, German commanders had operated with quiet certainty. The Americans valued mass over quality. Shermans were predictable, fast, lightly armored, and easily destroyed at long range. It was a formula the Panzerwaffe understood completely. But now, without warning, a single American tank had shattered that formula. Field reports painted the same unsettling picture. A Panther was destroyed with a single frontal shot at short range. Another tank followed minutes later. The crew never saw it coming. Witnesses insisted the shell seemed faster, sharper, different. Some swore it wasn't even a tank, that perhaps the Americans had hidden an anti-aircraft gun inside the city. Confusion reigned. Frontline officers didn't wait for official orders to process what this meant. Rumors spread faster than directives. A new Sherman, they called it at first, the long gun Sherman. In reality, the Pershing was nothing like its predecessor, but the lack of accurate information only amplified the fear. If they didn't understand it, they couldn't prepare for it. German heavy tank units had built their confidence on the idea that the first shot was theirs, and it would always be fatal. Now that certainty cracked, what if the Americans could hit back? Or worse, hit first? The intelligence gap was absolute. German training manuals didn't mention such a vehicle. Recognition cards didn't exist. Even high command struggled to believe the reports. Some officers dismissed the encounter as exaggeration or battlefield panic. But frontline crews weren't theorizing. They'd watched a Panther burn in the shadow of the Cologne cathedral. In the following days, field transmissions became fragmented with frantic descriptions. Long barrel, new gun, strong armor. Units began approaching combat more cautiously, no longer assuming they could dictate the engagement. And in tank warfare, hesitation is death. The Pershing didn't just appear on the battlefield, it tore a hole in German certainty. The myth of technological dominance, so carefully built over years of hard fighting, now had its first fracture. When the first damaged Pershing components fell into German hands, engineers expected confirmation of their long-held assumptions. They believed the Americans were masters of quantity, not refinement, good at producing endless Shermans, but incapable of matching German craftsmanship. What they found instead was a machine built on a different philosophy, one that struck at the very foundation of their confidence. The turret came first, hauled to a technical unit on a rail flat car. Inspectors walked its curved surface, tapping with tools, tracing seams. It wasn't welded together like their own designs. It was cast in a single piece, a feat that would have taken German factories weeks, but which American production lines could repeat at scale. That alone was unsettling. Then came the powertrain. The Pershing's Ford GAF V8 was simple, powerful, and worst of all, reliable. German tank engines often groaned under their own weight, plagued by maintenance issues and fuel demands. This American engine, by contrast, was engineered for endurance rather than perfection, a steady heartbeat instead of a temperamental pulse. The transmission puzzled them next. Smooth power transfer, advanced gear design, the sort of engineering that on paper should have been too complex for mass production. And yet, here it was, working cleanly. Then they examined the gun, 90 millimeters of American steel, a weapon originally designed to bring down aircraft, now mounted on a tank. It could punch through frontal armor their crews once considered untouchable. The realization sank in quietly. What Germany had achieved through specialization, the Americans had achieved through industrial momentum. And then came the details, small things that spoke volumes. Gun stabilization, allowing the Pershing to fire accurately on the move. Power traverse, rotating the turret in seconds, something that could mean life or death in a duel. Crew ergonomics, spacious interior, padded surfaces, thoughtful lighting, wet ammunition stowage to reduce the risk of catastrophic fires. German officers exchanged looks as they flipped through technical notes. This wasn't just a tank, it was proof that the enemy had learned. For years, German crews had believed their engineering culture was inherently superior. It was more precise, more elegant, more lethal. But now, in the cold light of a workshop, they saw something far more dangerous, a design built to be good enough, and built by the thousands. The Pershing didn't dazzle them with exotic solutions. It terrified them with practicality. By mid-March 1945, the impact of the Pershing was no longer measured in tank kills, but in hesitation. Rumors of the long-gun Sherman had spread through the Panzerwaffe like smoke seeping through cracks in a wall, thin at first, then everywhere. Crews who once faced Allied armor with the calm assurance of superiority now approached each engagement with a new corrosive question: what if it's one of them? Reports from frontline units reflected this change. Panthers began pulling back after first contact instead of charging forward to exploit range advantages. Tigers, once immovable predators, started withdrawing to secondary positions if their first shot didn't land a kill. Mechanics documented a surge in irreparable vehicles, tanks abandoned for faults that would have been patched up in hours earlier in the war. A thrown track, a fuel line issue, even an overheated engine was now enough for some crews to walk away. This wasn't logistical collapse alone. It was psychological erosion. For years, German heavy armor units had operated under the assumption that their tanks were the apex predators of the battlefield. Even when surrounded, outnumbered, or low on fuel, they trusted the steel under them. That belief gave them teeth. The Pershing had quietly dulled them. A Panther crew north of Bonn reported a Sherman column approaching. Instead of holding their ridgeline, they fell back 2 kilometers without firing a shot. Interrogations later revealed their reasoning. If it had been one of the new tanks, we would have died before the second shot. Another unit delayed an ambush to double-check optics. Seconds lost that turned into an Allied breakthrough. These moments never appeared as grand defeats in the records. They showed up as missed opportunities, as strangely short firefights, as engagements that ended before they began. German command tried to stamp out the panic. Official dispatches insisted the new American tank was rare, that it posed no strategic shift. But soldiers don't believe memos. They believe what they see, and what they saw were Panthers burning with a single hit. The Pershing was still statistically insignificant, barely a few dozen across the front, but perception doesn't care about numbers. The myth of German armored invulnerability was no longer intact. It was splintering, and with every rumor, every whispered long gun, the fracture widened. The Pershing never arrived on the Western Front in overwhelming numbers. Barely a few dozen machines rumbled through the mud and shattered streets of Germany. Yet in the minds of many German tank crews, there were hundreds, an unseen growing force lurking behind every hedgerow at the end of every road. It started with rumors. A Panther knocked out by a single frontal shot became, in the retelling, a platoon of Pershings. An ambush that went wrong was blamed not on positioning or fatigue, but on a new American tank with a monstrous gun. Small engagements turned into stories told in dugouts and command posts, each version more dramatic than the last. German command noted something strange. Allied tank activity appeared to be growing faster than reconnaissance confirmed. Entire sectors reported Pershing sightings, where none had been deployed. This was the phantom Pershing effect. A handful of tanks multiplying through fear. Frontline behavior changed accordingly. Platoon leaders requested reinforcements before engaging even small American columns. Some units repositioned preemptively, assuming they faced a superior weapon. In some cases, crews abandoned favorable positions entirely rather than risk standing against an enemy they couldn't identify. The power of the Pershing wasn't in its armor or its gun alone. Its power came from being unknown. German crews had built their confidence on predictability, knowing the enemy's weapons, knowing exactly how many seconds they had before a Sherman shell bounced off their armor. Now that certainty was gone. A Tiger crew near Remagen delayed engagement long enough for American forces to flank their position. Their post-action report admitted it plainly. We could not confirm whether it was the new tank. We hesitated. That hesitation rippled outward like shock waves. Commanders couldn't build solid defensive lines when their tankers no longer trusted their advantage. Orders lost their edge when the men receiving them questioned whether they were being sent to fight shadows. The Pershing didn't need to be everywhere. It only needed to be possible. By late March, the Phantom Pershing was shaping German strategy more effectively than air raids or artillery bombardment. Armored formations repositioned, retreated, or abandoned objectives without ever seeing the tank that terrified them. A few dozen machines had become an invisible army. In the steel arteries of Detroit, the war was already won before the first Pershing rolled into battle. While German engineers labored over blueprints and prototypes, the United States turned its entire industrial heartland into a war engine. Assembly lines that once produced automobiles now stamped out armor plates, cast turrets, and delivered tanks with the precision of clockwork. Every new tank wasn't just a weapon, it was proof that American industry could scale power faster than Germany could respond. At the Grand Blanc arsenal, furnaces burned day and night. Hundreds of Pershing components rolled past sparks and hammers, workers moving like a single organism. Ford engines arrived in crates by the hundreds, gun barrels were rifled in endless sequence, and turrets were cast as effortlessly as Detroit had once built Buicks. Across the Atlantic, German factories were burning too, but in a very different way. Allied bombers had crushed production capacity. Supply chains were fractured, raw materials scarce, trained labor replaced by barely trained youth. A Tiger tank required weeks of careful assembly, endless machining, and skilled hands Germany could no longer afford to spare. The contrast was brutal. By war's end, the U.S. had produced over 2,200 Pershings, while Germany struggled to deliver even a fraction of that in heavy armor. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, but also a monument to inefficiency. It was beautiful in the way dying empires are beautiful, intricate, expensive, and fragile. German tankers knew these numbers too. Rumors of production rates filtered through interrogations, captured documents, or whispered intelligence briefings. They understood what it meant. They weren't just facing better weapons, they were facing a nation capable of replacing every loss faster than Germany could name them. That knowledge carried a weight heavier than any shell. Even if they destroyed a Pershing today, another could arrive tomorrow, and another. And another. By April 1945, Pershing wasn't just a tank. It was the visible symbol of an industrial storm Germany could not withstand. The Tiger might have been stronger, but the Pershing had something greater behind it, an entire nation's assembly line. The first time German crews climbed inside a captured Pershing, they expected clumsy engineering, crude metal, awkward layouts, the kind of machine that could be built fast but not well. What they found instead left them silent. The interior was unexpectedly human, spacious, logically arranged, and almost comfortable. Control levers were within easy reach. Ammunition was stored in protective, water-filled racks designed to keep the tank from turning into a furnace if struck. Light fixtures glowed softly inside, illuminating every corner. To men used to the cramped, furnace-like insides of Tigers and Panthers, it felt like stepping into a machine that had been built for the crew, not simply around the gun. One of the most striking discoveries was a small, ruggedized phone mounted on the rear of the tank. It allowed infantry to speak directly with the crew. German tankers stared at it, realizing how much simpler that made combined arms operations. No shouting, no hand signals, just a phone. Then there was the gun stabilization system. It wasn't perfect, but it was effective enough to keep the barrel steady on the move, something no German heavy tank could do. The power traverse mechanism whirred smoothly, rotating the massive turret in seconds. German systems often relied on muscle or slow hydraulics. This was effortless. The more they examined, the deeper the shadow grew. Each feature represented a different way of thinking. German tanks were built like dueling pistols, precise, beautiful, but unforgiving. The Pershing was designed like a soldier's rifle, rugged, practical, repeatable. Engineers scribbled notes. Officers exchanged thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They could match some of these features, perhaps, but they couldn't match the scale behind them, the quiet certainty that thousands more just like this one were rolling off production lines across the ocean. Veteran crews who had once mocked the Sherman now avoided jokes entirely. They weren't laughing at the Pershing. They were calculating what it meant. It wasn't just a tank. It was a reflection of an enemy whose war machine had grown smarter, faster, and more relentless. For 3 years, German tank crews had carried a quiet certainty with them into every battle. It wasn't just steel and gunpowder. It was faith. Faith that their Tigers and Panthers were unmatched. Faith that no matter how many Shermans appeared on the horizon, they would strike first, strike hardest, and survive. In March 1945, that faith began to die. The Pershing was not everywhere, but the idea of it was. Reports of a single tank destroying German armor at Cologne spread through every armored regiment like a chill wind. Command tried to calm them with statistics. Only a handful of these tanks existed, they said. But numbers don't matter to men who have watched something they were told couldn't happen. Field behavior shifted fast. Crews that once would have held a line now backed away after the first exchange. Mechanics reported a rising tide of irreparable tanks, engines that could have been fixed, tracks that could have been replaced. But the will to fix them was slipping away. In some units, tankers abandoned vehicles at the first mechanical fault. Others surrendered intact machines to advancing Allied infantry. More often, they simply walked away under cover of darkness, leaving their once prized steel beasts in shallow ditches and ruined streets. For the Wehrmacht High Command, this collapse was terrifying because it was invisible. No single battle broke the Panzerwaffe. No massive defeat shattered its backbone. Instead, it crumbled from within. Each whispered rumor of the Pershing, each burned Panther, each delayed shot chipped away at a foundation that had taken years to build. Tank warfare had always been psychological, as much as mechanical. The first shot wasn't just about who hit first. It was about who believed they would. And now, when German gunners looked through their optics, they no longer believed with certainty that they were the hunter. They hesitated, and hesitation in tank duels is a death sentence. By late March, entire units were being repositioned before fighting even began. Local commanders reported strange patterns, defensive lines dissolving at the sound of tank engines, veteran crews volunteering to retreat, supply units misplacing fuel to avoid advancing to the front. The myth of invincibility had been their armor. Once it cracked, no amount of steel could save them.